This is Charles and David Koch, oil barons with personal fortunes of over $21 billion each. But perhaps their greatest achievement is helping convince the world that global warming doesn't exist. In the early 1990s, a scientific consensus began to emerge that burning fossil fuels, such as oil and coal, was changing the Earth's climate. In order to protect profits, these industries devised a plan to reposition global warming as a theory and not fact, and designed what a recent Greenpeace report dubbed the climate change denial machine.
It's a network of corporations and think tanks, front groups, who try to lie about the climate science, stop policies that will solve global warming. Of all the dirty energy money that's coming into Washington trying to influence policies, Koch is the worst. Koch is the largest donor, and nobody's ever heard of him.
The denial machine works like this. As citizens, we generally don't trust what energy industry representatives tell us about climate change. But we do trust these messages when given to us by experts or by our peers. In 2007, Koch paid scientists to publish a bogus study that polar bears weren't being affected by climate change. They've invested millions of dollars turning George Mason University into what Mother Jones magazine called a haven for climate deniers, and even underwritten denier conferences. But while the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change brought together over 600 authors from 40 countries for their latest report, renowned skeptic Steve Malloy admits that his side is vastly outnumbered.
It's really amazing, and it's really sort of a band of about 25 people, I guess, maybe a few more. And most recent polls show that more people feel more strongly on my side than on the Al Gore's side.
So how has such a small minority overcome an almost total consensus among climate scientists? Here we come to the true genius of the denial machine, the echo chamber. In order to give the impression of a genuine scientific debate, the Kochs have funded dozens of supposedly independent think tanks, whose army of staffers disseminate this doubt throughout the media and launch coordinated attacks on real climate scientists. They've created Americans for Prosperity, who poses concerned citizens.
A stop in Wichita today for a national group on a hot air balloon tour.
The Hot Air Tour, a rally against what organizers call global warming alarmist legislation.
They fund business groups, women's groups, college groups, seniors groups, and even church groups, all adding to the chorus of climate denial. Add to this the tens of millions the Kochs have funneled into lobbying and political donations, and it's not hard to see why no political action has been taken. The denial machine, it can't change the science, but its brilliance in shaping public opinion has helped the Kochs' income soar, while the rest of us get taken for a ride.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I taught sociology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Throughout history and around the world, in every society in which wealth and income have been unequally distributed, the poor have suffered deaths and disabilities at higher rates than the wealthy. These rates of death are man-made, collective decisions on how to share or not share wealth and income. All the wars, murders, suicides, and genocides of history have not begun to kill as many people as have been killed by the economic deprivations of the poor. 15 to 20 million deaths are caused by this sort of structural violence every year. Every 15 years, as many people die because of relative poverty as would be killed in a nuclear war that killed 232 million people. These aren't acts of God. They could be prevented. The deaths are byproducts of the pursuit of maximizing wealth, privilege, and power. And nowhere is this better played out more destructively than in the vast far right wing ultra-libertarian political empire of Charles Koch and Koch Industries, which has amassed a fortune of some $125 billion. They've created a massive network of integrated pro-corporate organizations, including academic centers, think tanks, legislation mills, student groups, media outlets, political field operations, lobbying groups, and litigation offices. They've co-opted social movements like the Tea Party. Many would say that most of the Republican Party has been co-opted by them too. Probably a few Democrats as well. These anti-democracy political machines are intentionally designed to reverse many of the progressive gains made over the past 50 years, especially those in the areas of civil rights and labor rights, as well as consumer and environmental protections. Koch Industries are the primary sponsors of climate change deniers in the United States and are wreaking havoc, untold misery, increasing poverty and structural violence over much of the globe. The Koch network strategy works best when it remains hidden. But fortunately, we have activists and scholars like our guest today on The Radical Imagination, who has written a book to take on and expose one of the most significant parts of the story. Ralph Wilson is the co-author of the soon-to-be-published Free Speech and Koch Money, a meticulously documented and highly accessible field guide to the Koch donor network's influence on college campuses. He takes us through an ingenious and brilliantly conceptualized strategy of manufacturing a free speech crisis on American college campuses as a cornerstone of the Koch mission to fundamentally remake institutions of higher education and bend America to their plutocratic neo-fascist vision. So, Ralph, welcome again to the Radical Imagination. You've really taken it on this time. And this is an incredible, I've read the preview of it, of the book, and it's a tour de force. It is, as I said to you, I wish it enormous success. It follows in the tradition of Jane Mayer's Dark Money. I congratulate you as an academic, as an activist, and as a human being who would like to see us all survive and live much more happily than many of us are. So thank you again, Ralph, and thank you again for being on the show.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Sure. I wanted to start off just briefly here. Could you tell us how this book is divided and structured? What are your sources and methods? And again, I'm being a little academic here, but I think it would help us understand the context of this book, what's about. What is your method of operative tracing, as you put it?
Yeah, well, it's a little unique in that the book really sources every possible avenue of information because, as you mentioned, the network and the strategy at play here is very covert. And so really researchers and activists are kind of left scrambling to find absolutely anything, any information source that they can find. So, we have, a large kind of complex story to tell, but, it's sourced from, anywhere from leaked recordings from inside Koch network meetings to archived websites of the organizations to CVs, public records requests. Basically, it's sort of a grab bag of sources because what you're trying to do is essentially reconstruct something that's happening in a black box as much as possible. And so basically, it's a little bit like what I used to do in chaos theory. You have a ton of stuff that just looks totally disordered, but you have to put it together in such a way that you reconstruct what's actually happening in the system. And so, we put our story together and then on top of that, sort of do a larger financial analysis using 990 forms and kind of look at totals of who's donating to what parts of what the political machine, essentially.
You mentioned chaos here. What was your background as a in
I was
college?
a applied and pure mathematician and physicist. Got a
Physicist,
little
right?
into engineering, but yeah, chaos theory was kind of the core of it, and it really just at its heart, it's taking something that seems like it doesn't have a pattern, but looking at it in a special way that allows the pattern to emerge. It allows you to really see what appeared hidden at first or too complex to understand, and that's really the challenge that we see with the Koch network. They're able to fund hundreds of organizations that seem like they're functioning independently, and it looks like they're all independent and there's no pattern to what's going on at first glance. But sort of the method of the book and the research more generally is to try to pull all of that together into one place so that you can actually see its cohesion.
Yeah, the obfuscation is incredible, and I understand why they want to keep it hidden. So, actually, this is resonating more and more across various circles in academia and public media and so on. I just noticed yesterday's Times, Michelle Goldberg, to quote her, September 20th, in the New York Times, article on middle-aged sadness behind the cancel culture panic. And she quotes Adam Gurry in his essay in Liberal Currents, looked at empirical evidence that might tell us how big a crisis academic cancellations really are, and it came away nonplussed. The Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, for example, documents 426 cases of scholars targeted for sanctions by ideological adversaries since 2015, a relatively small number given the size of American higher education. If any other problem in social life was occurring at the frequency, at this scale, we would consider it effectively solved. And furthermore, further on, she points out, a number of state laws have shaped what academics can say, but those laws aimed at critical race theory censor the left. There is a crisis of intellectual liberty in the country, but the victims are overwhelmingly people in red states who teach about racism. Now, I've sort of jumped ahead here of your story, your narrative. So let's back up a couple of feet here and talk about the confrontational crises of so-called free speech that the Koch brothers and their operatives have tried to instill in us. And why are they doing that? How do they do that? Who are some of the people they're using to provoke us? And why is this so central to understanding their attempt to basically take over the country ideologically, economically, morally, spiritually, intellectually?
Right. Well, Koch Industries and the Kochs have constantly sort of been exposed and then tried to rebrand, been exposed and tried to rebrand. They have a cycle of, they have a legitimacy crisis. Basically, they're constantly trying to solve, while at the same time just throwing increasing amounts of money into politics and nonprofits and academia. As part of that. And so really their challenge, as seen in a leaked recording, was to capture, they didn't think that they were going to convince progressives to support their agenda. And so they saw it as a fight for the middle third. They had the right that, the third of the population that they'd already captured, a third of the population that they'd given up on, and they saw the future of politics as a fight for that remaining middle third. And one really excellent way to do this, and it was similar to how the Koch family and the John Birch Society fought against the civil rights movement during the 60s, was not to try to convince people that civil rights is not an issue per se, but to polarize people against the tactics that civil rights activists and advocates were taking. And so, you see the rise of Black Lives Matter coinciding quite directly with this shift to a reactionary, protection of free speech, or, callings. Suddenly there's a free speech crisis. And in fact, what they're succeeding in doing is polarizing sort of middle of the road, moderates or sort of liberals into this call to protect free speech, something that they would expect them to do, But incidentally, in standing up for free speech in this context, they're also essentially standing against the current civil rights movement. And so by creating this sort of covert culture war, they've effectively helped polarize the nation around the current struggle, movement for Black lives, all manner of things. And in doing so, there's a big, shiny, loud distraction when provocateurs come to campus, and people think, well, that's awful, that people should be allowed to talk, and this is a problem in and of itself. But what they don't see is the foundation and the context in which that's taking place. These provocateurs are invited to campus by student groups that are funded by the Koch network. There's a foundation first, that's how the provocateurs are even getting onto campus. And then these provocateurs only have a career because of these corporate donors who are funding them and allowing their ideas to continue in the public domain when normally they would be selected out. They're speaking fringe things that are only supported, that they only have a platform that continues because of these donors. And so you have these crises that they feel like they can move public opinion on these crises. But what the public doesn't see is that feeds this larger political machination that results in, like you're describing, this wave of laws. Looking at over 100 bills that have been filed. And when people think, oh, campus, there's free speech, we need to protect it. Oh, there's a bill to protect it. Well, then maybe that bill should pass. You're creating a larger sort of base of support for these laws, and these laws are never what they seem. And in fact, they punish demonstrations, they punish protests, protected free speech, and some of them do even more radical things. There's provisions that are hidden in there that people wouldn't expect to see, and so it's just a very large structure, and basically they're trying to get people to act by only looking at the tip of the iceberg and not understanding what lies beneath.
Wow. I was just thinking as you were talking, I mean, Sigmund Freud would have a field day. We could get Koch in his office and try to figure out what layers of he's involved in and trying to do this, and what's behind all this. But we had Ian Haney Lopez on I think 2-3 weeks ago on the show, who wrote Dog Whistle Politics. And there's a quote from him in one of the other Michelle Goldberg's articles, op-eds, in which he's agreeing with what you've just said. The inversion casting anti-racist activists as the real racist is familiar to Lopez, a law professor at the University of California, Berkeley, who specializes in critical race theory. There's a rhetoric of reaction which seeks to claim that it's defending these higher values, which perversely often are the very values it is trying to do away with. Whether that's in the name of free speech, we're going to persecute, we're going to launch investigations into particular forms of speech, or, and I think this is equally perverse, in the name of fighting racism, we're going to launch investigations into those scholars who are most serious about studying the complex forms that racism takes. Pretty amazing, right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and that raises a question that Judith Butler also raises in her classic 2000 essay, Limits on Free Speech, ? Which you're tackling in the book. She raises the question of what free speech really means to fascists. What's the purpose behind really the use of these incendiary provocations? What's the end game? How do you deal with these sorts of people?
Well, it's really difficult because accepting the framing of the language gives them the advantage that they are seeking. And so the real challenge, in the book, we essentially try to say the answer is not to necessarily directly engage in this free speech debate.
Follow the money, right?
Follow the money, exactly. But even when you follow the money, there are still billionaires funding untold platforms where these barkers are essentially still calling the free speech crisis a crisis, and it's spreading to other countries. And you know, as we explore in the last chapter, and so they're really, you know, it's not a problem that you can ignore, that will go away even after, you know, a global pandemic, even after an insurrection. There's still this burning crisis that they've ultimately created and manufactured, and really the difficult question of separating out what they're calling free speech and what they're advancing on campus is ultimately the real trick. You know, by saying, okay, you're calling for free speech for scholars, and yet the reforms that you're seeking on campus don't actually align, because the problem is what the right has consistently done is conflate free speech with academic freedom on campus, or, you know, fail to make the distinction. And it's a very important one, and it's obviously one that gives them issues because it comes down to regulated speech, well-regulated speech within the academy. I mean, you have things like peer review and things like that that limit what, you know, the forum that they're sort of claiming academia to be. You know, it's not a public park. This is, you know, this is a really, you know, very old, very, very much self-regulated. Yeah. And it's a community that they're essentially trying to come in and say, oh, we understand your values better than you do. In fact, let us reform this. And they're trying to transform universities in such a way that protects their interest and their increasing foothold on college campuses, while punishing or chilling the free speech of those who would criticize them. And increasingly, they've taken this campus free speech crisis and conflated it with the real additional crisis that they're causing of academic freedom. You know, my past research and the research in chapter 7 in the book really looks at, you know, how are they using their campus philanthropy to advance their political agenda. And that's something that, you know, with the research that I've been involved in over the past decade has really been exposed, and they're really scrambling to protect their ability to create programs and centers to propagandize students and to legitimize the other sectors of their political work. And so they have a vested interest in conflating free speech and academic freedom on campuses, so that they can use this absolutist free speech frame to, you know, essentially trap the idealists into supporting them.
Yeah, I want to get into just a few minutes case study at John Jay as well. But you know what, I want to ask you as well, what's the role, if any, of the alt-right or neo-Nazis or Proud Boys in this political strategy? I don't think you mentioned that much, or are they part of this in some way?
Well, you know, this is like many things. This is something that's kind of played out in previous versions before, and sort of the academics that are really the backbone of the Koch network group of scholars are the Austrian school sort of free market academics who, you know, pioneered what was known as the paleo-libertarian movement, which was in the 90s, an effort, you know, by sort of the Ron Paul world at the time to build explicit bridges to the far right and to fascists, because ultimately they had a shared interest in subverting the federal government, in subverting the authority of state and local governments. And basically they realized that they could build an allegiance. And, you know, that mirrors precisely what was done by, you know, the Koch family and the John Birch Society in the 50s and 60s. You know, they were libertarians who built explicit alliances with groups like the White Citizens Council to oppose, you know, specifically openly oppose the civil rights movement at the time. And so for it to have happened, it's a known connection that libertarians and fascists have this shared interest. And in the past have explicitly, this same political network has shared this agenda with them and worked alongside them, which we examine throughout the book, kind of this repeating motif. And so there are too many incidental connections and direct connections that we see. We see the Koch network funding things like Turning Point USA, which are these crypto-fascist groups that pretend to be campus groups. We see them funding organizations that crank out alt-right talent and directly funding, donors like the Mercers supporting people like Milo Yiannopoulos. We basically see that there's too many connections not to call it a bridge, and they're working so directly in tandem. Up until the people become untenable, you see, libertarian student groups supporting someone like Milo Yiannopoulos until he becomes too toxic, in which case they scrub their website of blogs that are supportive of him and say, oh, we just need more libertarianism. We don't need this all right. So once it became too hot, you see these more mainstream free market groups trying to distance themselves, but they're intricately tied and have been for decades with these far right groups. And so looking at them, following the money and knowing basically what networks to be looking at, there's just unbroken ties from the direct working alongside, white hate groups like the White Citizens Council. There's just unbroken ties to modern day Koch libertarians working alongside and ultimately having alt-right figures within their own ranks that they claim, oh, we had no idea. And it turns out again and again, you find Koch world operatives that were also, on neo-Nazi chat rooms or, working with the movements like the white identity movement and things like that. So it's too close to call it a coincidence.
And of course, we add in the Fox News media, Murdochs, and Coulters, those type. Let me offer just a mini bridge here. This has been going on for a while. I went to the University of Colorado in 1964 to 68. And Joe Coors, Coors beer, everybody, boycott it, was a regent. And my first sociology course was with a Professor Ray Kuzort. We subsequently wrote a book together on statistical reasoning. But the point is, Coors demanded that all the professors had to sign a loyalty oath. and so this goes way back. I think it was 64, 65. Kuzort was the one that he wasn't going to do it. And they were going to fire him, and he had another job lined up at the University of Chicago. And anyway, and they made, I don't know, whatever the hell they did. They smoothed it over something or other, and he stayed. But this goes way back. This stuff goes way back.
It does.
It's not, and I in terms of actually going way back, I want to make sure that people who are listening to our show here understand the difference between those who do remember it or know of it. When you were talking about the free speech movement in Berkeley, with Mario Savio, this has nothing to do with what you're talking about, right? Exactly.
Right. And if anything, there's a deliberate attempt to stylize the current free speech movement, campus free speech movement, as a resurgence of the original progressive free speech movement in the 60s. And the libertarians, in Koch's network really have focused on how can we build a successful social movement in order to support our political operation. And because they understand that you can't just throw money at politics, and they needed to create the false appearance of a social movement. And so they've been studying, it's something that they concern themselves with greatly. And they emulate as much as possible successful social movements. That, that's definitely one of them. So I think, if anything, it's just an effort to make a carbon copy to, for someone who just sees it as a glance, they will it'll for them harken back to that original free speech movement, and they'll say, yes, I agreed with it then, and I probably agree with it now.
Again, to confuse and obfuscate and so on. Yeah. If we can just spend a few minutes here on case study at John Jay College, where I taught. And these are for articles that came out in the New York Post and elsewhere. The new president, Terrell Mason, who took over, I think, in 2017, talking about criminal justice reform at the Aspen Institute, where she was invited, as they put it. John Jay, President Carol Mason was a featured speaker for the Aspen Institute's Conversation with Great Leaders, which was created in memory of Steve, businessman and philanthropist Preston Tisch. And the talk was to form a more perfect union, reforming the criminal justice system. And in her comments, in questions afterwards, quote unquote, to say today, I see the good news is there's a limit of what the federal government can do. Mason also encouraged people to avoid the rhetoric, noting that criminal justice reform was a bipartisan issue. The Koch brothers are just as committed to this work as all of us in this room. It's the notion that this country is built on fairness, opportunity, and people committed on that to that are run across the political spectrum. Now that's her own words. That there's an article in the Post, New York Post. Again, this was a couple of years ago, January 2000. John Jay College rejects money from Koch brothers, but you got to listen to this very carefully. CUNY and its faculty, as you know, are constantly crying poverty, but some money is simply no good to them, supposedly. The Koch Foundation, of course, did not respond to requests for comment about its giving. In a December meeting with the anti-Koch faculty members, which I was part of, one of the 20 or so, President Mason said she wouldn't put the Koch solicitation ban in writing lest she scare off other donors with what could be perceived as the school's undue scrutiny of their cash. I mean, can you believe this? I'm not making this up, okay? And Mason said she would not hinder individual professors from accepting Koch grants. So here's the John Jay College rejects money from Koch brothers. Next page is, well, come on in. We're not going to maybe flagrantly go out and try to get you, but you're welcome anyway. And then she goes on, the Koch brothers, okay. Okay, that's one article from me. And and just bear with me because I think this is important for what you've been trying to get across here. And it goes to the original interests of Koch Industries in so-called criminal justice reform. Mark Holden, who has been invited numerous times to Smart on Crime conferences that are held at John Jay College. He's the Koch General Counsel, who's overseeing Koch Industries' criminal justice reform work, acknowledges that the brothers were motivated to give money to the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers after being prosecuted for environmental crimes in 2000. Okay, there's various cases here that they went through. The Justice Department oversaw the department's environmental crime section, has called one of the most significant cases ever brought under the Clean Air Act was against, of course, the Koch brothers. In a settlement, here's the important point. The original 97 charges were dropped, including criminal charges against 4 company employees, but Koch Industries pleaded guilty to 1 count of concealing information from the government about its discharge of benzene. The company agreed to pay a $10 million fine to pay $10 million more to improve the environment in Corpus Christi. It was a huge overreach, a grave injustice, Holden says. We're very skeptical going forward of criminal prosecutors having too much power. So we got involved in criminal justice reform.
Yeah.
So it's talking out of both sides of your mouth at the same time here and giving money here and there to left groups, the Innocence Project or this and that. But well, go ahead. You comment. I have another longer, and then I promise no more long letters here or anything, but
no, I think it's terribly important. You know, it's really another, and it's a very, I think it's a very similar example of, you know, this network trying to co-opt something that's of critical importance and that people have every reason to support on its face. But when you scratch the surface, you find out that what they're actually, you know, putting this rhetoric on top of are self-serving policy reforms. The reforms that they supported in their efforts to advance criminal justice reform were white collar decriminalizations. Now they could go so far as to maybe lend their support behind some other reforms, but what they were holding out on and what they withheld their support on other reforms until they got was massive decriminalization of white collar crimes. They were trying to push for massive difficulties to be placed on prosecutors who were trying to prosecute white collar crimes. They wanted them to have to be able to prove mens rea, criminal intent, for any federal violation, which in order to prosecute white collar criminals, it would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to prove criminal intent for some large corporate crime, given the distributed nature of some of these crimes. And so, what they're ultimately holding out for, they're not saying at all, but they will advance the rhetoric that they think is popular at the time. At a moment when this nation so desperately needs criminal justice reform, they couldn't even be bothered to genuinely support it. They could only opportunistically sneak self-serving reforms into this critical issue. And when that didn't work, they were exposed essentially for that. Jane Mayer helped expose them and others. Essentially they're left looking for a new way to rebrand themselves. What's a new popular thing? What's a new movement that we can either create or glom onto? And they're also doing a lot of anti-war stuff at a time when it's decades too late, and they supported the war hawks, that created the problem. Just like, they supported in the 90s the tough on crime movement that created the criminal justice crisis. They supported the creation of the problem, and now they're trying to use the solution to benefit again.
And John Jay's president, previous to Mason, Jeremy Travis, was very much part of that effort too, the 1993 crime bill and so on. And they sponsor small non-crime conferences every year. And just give you an example of the featured speakers. They sprinkle, lefty, liberal, conservative, but here are some featured speakers. This was, I guess, a couple of years ago. Include Eric Holder, all right, former U.S. Attorney General, Governor Nathan Deal of Republican of Georgia, Cory Booker, Anquan Bolden, retired NFL wide receiver. Well, all right, Carol Mason, of course, Cyrus Vance, Mark Gonzalez, Nueces County, Texas District Attorney, and so on. And again, the partner organizations include Coalition for Public Safety, Gideon's Promise, Koch Industries, the Laura and John Arnold Foundations, and so on. So we'll get into that too. All right, I think the hypocrisy is just unbelievable. And this is a letter that was sent to us from President Mason after a meeting some of us had with her. And I'm going to, I'll just read excerpts. I think it's very, very germane to what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Following the introductions and a brief review of prior meetings, Mason announced he was willing to forego solicitation of funds from any Koch entities, and she hoped that would settle the issue at the college. Mason said she arrived at this decision out of respect for the strong opposition to Koch presence at John Jay College expressed by the coalition as well as other members of the college community. So that tells you something about the sort of pressure that can be applied. They do respond, they do react, but the pressure still has to be kept on continuously. Okay. Mason stressed the importance of raising funds for student success initiatives at our college. Who can argue with that? She explained she regarded Koch sources as a potential contributor to this fundraising effort. However, Koch sources were only one among a very large number of potential funding sources to which she planned to appeal. She also indicated she could not launch an effective broad-based funding appeal with the Koch controversy lingering at the college. But she did agree not to solicit funds from Koch sources. Now, on the other side of her mouth, she says she was in the process of formulating her fundraising plan. Want to know if there were objections to any other potential funders. Okay. She noted that while she would not raise funds from the Kochs, there would be no restriction on individual faculty members receiving funding from Koch or other funders. It was affirmed that at present, the college has received Koch funding via a grant solicited by the Center for Media, Crime, and Justice, one professor's research project, and also limited funding support for the Smart on Crime conference. Okay, let's go down here. She indicated, furthermore, she was unwilling to establish a committee or task force to draft guidelines to evaluate donor funding and influence ethics and conflicts of interest as our coalition proposed. And here's that word again. Further, Mason indicated she would not accept funding that undermined academic freedom, quote unquote, faculty control of a curriculum, or personnel actions. Last point we point out in this letter, the Koch's political philosophical agenda has been the major driving force in the reduction of funding to education in general and higher education in particular. In New York and across our nation, an entire generation of young adults and their parents carries this burden in the form of historically unprecedented educational debt. I need to tell our audience that. It is unjust and unwise to lend the good name of our educational institution and endeavors to a group that has worked to undermine the support, integrity, and independence of public higher education. So, Ralph, in lieu of Sigmund Freud, we must rely on you and other people, scholars and activists, to help us out of this morass of hypocrisy, double talk, and so on. What did you think of the letter? And this is nothing, it should surprise you, right? That this is the sort of language and sort of rhetoric they're using, et cetera, et cetera.
1 second.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's definitely just characteristic of the crisis, yet another crisis that administrators are finding themselves in all across the country. You know, there is a massive drought in educational funding, largely because of right-wing legislators funded by donors like Koch. And so just like the other issues that we've been talking about, they've created the crisis, and now they're trying to come riding in on what appears to be the solution, private funding for these universities. And but just like every other transaction that we've seen, there's strings attached, and that's really the one issue that I've spent a lot of the last decade demonstrating, that that the funding from the Koch Foundation and their partner donors, it does come with strings attached that violate academic freedom. And so any administrator should be fully skeptical and should expect that any single dollar coming from these donors comes with expectations that violate academic norms. And so these administrators are really stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, their job very much depends on raising big money donors, raising large amounts of money, and not as much protecting or investigating these sort of minute examples of what may or may not be academic freedom violations. They clearly are, but in the scope of an administrator's job, it's going to seem somewhat minor compared to raising a few $1 million. And so really the challenge here is unfortunately, as President Mason declined to do in the letter, are to create deeper bodies that can investigate, create committees. Faculty senates across the country have taken up the charge and investigated the funding and the strings attached, and have concluded that this money is toxic fully, and that it violates academic freedom, faculty governance, etc. And so there are things when this information is made public and exposed, there are ways that organizing can work within the academy. Students and faculty have pushed back, for example, at George Mason University in Virginia, which is ground zero for Koch's academic funding. George Mason housed and continues to house one of the longest standing campaigns, student and faculty campaigns against Koch funding. And among the many things that they've been able to achieve are, significant faculty involvement in policy changes, policy review, the ability to create committees that can examine these donor agreements and look for examples of donor influence. But at the same time, those efforts have, gotten the attention of what is now, a majority of progressive lawmakers that have turned the Virginia legislature blue. And as a result, the students are filing records requests, and their records requests at George Mason ultimately made it to the Virginia Supreme Court. And while the students ultimately weren't successful in getting the records that they were seeking in the Virginia Supreme Court, it exposed a flaw in Virginia law that lawmakers took up in the next two legislative sessions. And to date, I think something like 4 laws have been passed in Virginia in direct response to the faculty and student organizing at George Mason that make greater transparency, that make it harder for donors to attach strings to their money and remain anonymous, and so on. And so it's a long, difficult battle, especially if you're a student organizer and you're only spending a limited time inside a particular institution. But faculty organizing and student organizing, community organizing especially, can be successful. We can force these people into the light where the untoward things they're doing can no longer really be defensible. And so it just takes a long-standing resistance that the people have already been successfully leveraging, in these locales. People just have to essentially do the research, find the information, make it public, and apply the pressure, and don't stop.
And so there is light at the end of the tunnel. And that's why, among other things, you need to get your book, which will be out, in a month or so? Or when is that going to be?
Yes, November 20. So a couple months from now.
Wait. And absolutely. The other, do you know about the John and Joan Arnold Foundation as well? Again, these are President Travis, the ex-president, has hooked on with them. And so again, it's neoliberals, it's all kinds of faculty have to begin to understand how they're being hoodwinked. And last quote on this, the Arnold Foundation, again, from more of a seemingly neoliberal perspective, gives money to the Urban Institute, the Vera Institute for Justice. It has a community policing vision, community supervision vision, a reintegration vision, and more. All of these visions require more training, the creation of new institutional capacity to accommodate the reforms. All are bundled with offers of technical assistance to help jurisdictions introduce new practices. The use of risk assessments creates technological measurements of dangerousness and produces new criminal justice records. New kinds of jails and prisons are envisioned. The centrality of policing and carceral control are not questioned, but rather embellished. All of this expands rather than reduces the carceral system. So all of us have to be aware and of the dangerousness of what is happening, and all the liberal-minded professors have to understand what they are being part of, what they are promulgating, in a sense, and promoting, and the suffering that they don't necessarily see, they don't mean to, and they're trying to, help their careers and so on, get the grants. We all have to make these judgments and moral decisions. But there, as I said, we have a couple more minutes. I can't thank you enough, Ralph, for this show and your work over the last decade. I'm just so impressed and respect what you're doing so very, very much, really from the bottom of my heart. And I, again, am so glad as we end this, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, correct?
There's always power in organizing, and the Koch network has no plans to stop, and it leaves us with no choice but to act as though we are hopeful. And honestly, given how long they've been doing this, and how long, if people have been organizing against it recently. I think the people have more power, have more bang for their buck than the Koch network. They really have to outspend the people on legitimacy. And so I think if people get educated and keep organizing, I think the power is on our side.
Totally agree. Power of the people. This whole structure is a mess of. There's a house of cards about to fall apart. And
Absolutely.
We have no choice. It has to, and it will. And again, thank you so very, very much, Ralph. Take care, and I look forward to doing another show with you, and wish you all the very, very best.
Thanks, Jim. My pleasure.
Thank you again so very, very much for watching us on the show today with Ralph Wilson and his fabulous, fantastic new book, Free Speech and Koch Money. Very, very important book. And we look forward to seeing you again next week on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos.